How does Tanakh treat crisis?
It's funny because somebody once said to me, tongue in cheek, isn't like Melachim Bay is just like, Game of Thrones, and that obviously clearly not meant to be like that. But if you look at Tanakh has a lot of bad news in it. There's a lot of disturbing stories in Tanakh, and in fact, it seems that most of the good news is actually omitted. Like the 38 years in the Midbar where things were all right, where there was no complaints. That's gone in the pasuk. You
What,
know,
what
even like
year?
Shlomo Melech's time. Like it's a very small island amidst lots of complications and murder and complexity. And I think maybe, in fact, not only does Tanakh include crisis, I think perhaps part of the focus of Tanakh is crisis because it's trying to teach us how to deal or perhaps learn from those crises. So I think more than ever, it's perhaps the best guidebook for that. What do you
Absolutely.
think?
I think that in thinking about not just the content of Tanakh, but in thinking also just of the function of what Tanakh does for its readers, and for the culture that it inhabits, there's something worth reflecting upon that Tanakh tells us that we are not alone in history, and that the stories of the past inform the present, and we chart out our existence along something beyond our biological lives to connect to broader and longer themes, to a greater story of history and also that of destiny within what it is that we experience. And in thinking through what that means for a crisis, it means that we've been here before, that we're not alone, and that much of the philosophy around individualism today creates a buffer around the self that divorces those stories, those narratives, those strengthening chords that can help a person through crisis, in which people come to believe that everything that they're experiencing is the first time, and that it's never been done before and it's never been fought for before. And so the stresses of the life become that much more intense when you have nothing to lean on. And I think that Tanakh, and in this respect, Tanakh is an embodiment of perhaps other chords that can strengthen the human personality in face of crisis that our society, I think, is largely losing, both on with the secularization of the religion, but also with the abandonment of liberal arts to give people and to value the what we might call the software of human existence. That there's such an attention on hardware, on the materialism of life, that there's a great price to be paid at times of crisis when we need software. We need those stories to give us the strength to endure in moments of question, in moments of crisis.
Yeah, no, it's so funny you say that. Just, I happen to be going through right now Sefer Eov. It just happened to be what we're going through right now. And just yesterday, I was going through Perek Chof, and he says, I apologize, Perek Yud Test 2 days ago, and he said, it's an amazing. He says, I wish that somebody would be writing down my speeches. He said, if only somebody, because somebody in the future will seek the justice for me. He feels so that there's so much injustice in the world, and his friends don't see it, and he's talking this way. And I feel it's so funny. We're on the other end of that, and we're reading what was written down, the speeches he said he wished he would have done. For me, it was like a crossing Brooklyn Ferry moment, Lahavdil, where the poem reaches out and to the reader across time and space. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, is that, here we are in 2020 and we're reading Eov and we're reading all these different ideas, these narratives and these perspectives. And really it's the Nevi'im reaching into our very lives and contextualizing us and our experiences. There's this incredible connection that's going on. I think it's a very validating experience.
So being that there is this connection, so then what is the program? What is the software? What is the formula for how one deals with crisis that comes out of Tanakh? What could we say, perhaps to differentiate Tanakh from other forms uh, of, of human approaches to life that comes through the Tanakh that says, this is how you handle crisis?
I think if we all had one formula, then I think it would be an easy response. I think personally that because Tanakh is Nevuah, there is a what it was nichtav aladoris. The fact that we today are reading it and it was written for generations means that it has different resonance in different generations to different people. And I would even say in the same generation to different people, different resonances. Now that doesn't mean to say that anybody can make up anything they want and suck any kind of formula out of their thumb, but it does mean to say that there's a lot of depth there. In the same way that one of the points that Rabbi Chaim Volozhin points out why the Siddur needed to be created by the Anshe Knesset Agdola was because it was the last of the Nevi'im. The Anshe Knesset Agdola hosted Chagai, Zachariah, and Malachi, and they needed to inform, or to, so to speak, choreograph certain words which had depth for every person at every time, in every generation, and every person throughout the course of their lives. And I believe that Tanakh is even more than that. Tanakh has multiple layers of messaging, and that's why I think that different people resonate with different parts of it. So that's in general. I don't think there's any one formula. One thing I find personally, which is very deeply meaningful, is that one of my teachers, Rabbi Chaim Angel, had this perspective where if you go through most of Tanakh, already most of the Mefarshim point this out, is that Tanakh does not deal with the hereafter. Tanakh does not explicitly relate to life after death. Now, of course, there are many, many references, and the Midrash is replete with them showing you how the Psukim mean that. But on an explicit level, the Torah does not say, do good here because you're going to get paid then. And there's many, many, many Mefarshim and debate this. The Kleyakar summarizes the many Pirushim of the Abarbanel, the beginning of Pashas B'chukoysa, and all the Rishonim deal with this. But Rabbi Angel's perspective is that a religion which spends its focus on the hereafter, in a certain sense, doesn't live in the here. It's all about, I will sacrifice anything now. I'll become a martyr for any cause or value because I can just blow myself up and get the world to come. But Tanakh doesn't work like that. Tanakh says, let's try to find justice. Let's try to find rectitude in this world. And therefore, the justice can only be found in the confines of this world, which is why Eov only fights for justice in this world. He dismisses the notion of this is for something in the future. And David HaMelech in Tehillim cries out about justice in this world, as opposed to saying, there's going to be a time in the future. And he knows this. These are tenets of basic Jewish faith. These are one of the 13 principles of faith. But the notion is that Tanakh focuses on the here because Tanakh expects us to fix the here, even though there is going to be a transition to the hereafter. I think one theory begadol, one thing I would say is that Tanakh is focused upon making this world a better place, making the people around us a better place. What do you think? That's one of my theories.
So it's a lot to digest all at once, Rabbi Trump. It's a lot going on. I would just add one point to your first response, which is to talk about the multiple audiences or the multiple personalities that have to gain sustenance from the Tanakh. But I think it's also worthwhile to reflect upon the fact that Tanakh speaks in multiple voices as well, that through the multiple Nevi'im, each Navi has a unique voice in which they speak in the name of God, and that's something of great meaning and great value. I would also add that there's something in terms of not just Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh within Tanakh, but there's something also about Emunah that also flows through Tanakh's perception and Tanakh's arguments. Again, obviously there are nuances because we're hearing multiple messages across time in which each crisis and each challenge is addressed by a distinct person living in a distinct life. But I think that we can speak about certain common themes. And I think the most basic of those themes is the recognition that God is involved in man's destiny, in the Jewish people's destiny. And that understanding of a brit, a covenant that is established between God and the Jewish people, being one that um, is one that we're held accountable to, and thinking through certain consequences to our actions, whether it be in the Tochacha or in the words of Nevi'im Achronim, but likewise also in um, the expectation of Geulah, of redemption as well. That whether it be in Yitzias Mitzrayim or even in the words of Navi Yirmiyahu, that we believe that we're part of a grand story, a grand narrative, and to think about one's personal struggles in the context of this great national story allows for a perspective that gets us off the here and now and gets us up onto that a 30,000 foot view of our piece within a story. And I know that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his book, A Letter and a Scroll, talks about Jewish continuity in terms of this grand narrative, which he sees as being something that's being constantly written. And that the end of Tanakh does not mean that that writing in that scroll, not a literal scroll of a Torah Shebechsav, but rather the scroll of Jewish destiny, is something which is continuing. And I think that whereas he might have written it in the context of assimilationist pressures upon our people, I think that message has just as much resonance in periods of trial and periods of crisis. That we are not just people whose lives are absent of meaning, but that we can, tapping into that meaning, can gain a certain strength in enduring many types of crises.
I hear you. That's a very, very, very good point you're raising. I kind of wonder to myself sometimes when I think about this, and it's not as well articulate as you just put it, but I wonder about this point is that, would it be popular to read the newspaper with a biblical voice? You know what I mean? It's like imagine that Jeremiah walked into town, Jeremiah walked into town today, and we have the crisis. What would he say? Like in those days, so they had a geopolitical crisis, right? Israel there was this new terror in the north. Its name was Babylon. And what is Israel doing? They're having alliance meetings down in Egypt. They're having a convention, and they're trying to work out the small nations getting together. And Jeremiah walks in, Jeremiah says, "It's all for naught. Believe in God, submit to them." And everybody said, "Listen, Jeremiah is very nice and everything like that. We're in the middle of a military campaign right now. Can you just please wait at the door?" That's what they basically said to him. And so, like he would walk in today and he'd say, thou sinners, thou should repent. And we would say, "Jeremiah, we're working on social distancing right now. Could you please just, stand by the door?" Sometimes the biblical voice is something which is not necessarily so, the voice that we first turn to. We're very into security. We're very into making sure that everybody's respected. But the idea, as you said, I would say inviting God into the equation is for the good and the not so good in our lives, meaning as you focused on in terms of the emunah, that we're part of a longer string of the 30,000 view of history. But there's also the aspect of it is that we have responsibility for our situation, and that's a voice which I think we're very fast to shoot down. Whenever you hear people pointing fingers or turning inwards, we see that as a cherry on the top. And I think that the biblical voice, the Tanakh narrative, would be quite different today than the view we hear from the correspondents and the journalists right now.
I think that points to a theme within Tanakh, which is a little bit radioactive. And that gets to the element of the Nevi'im that is calls forward God's judgment upon their contemporaries. And much of our world is about a certain individualism which excludes judgment and which allows for a particularity of truth that does not allow for the imposition of the prophetic voice or even the divine voice, if not filtered through the individual. That is something which is somehow a threat to our freedom. And it's a I think it's a common trope in terms of how Tanakh is pegged, that Tanakh is seen as being, certainly in Christian critiques of what they refer to as the Old Testament, as being a book about laws and anger and judgment and so on. I think there's a certain residue of that in terms of how our society approaches the stories of Tanakh and the meaning of Tanakh. And I would posit a different cultural approach to what Tanakh does. And if you would allow me, I'd like to suggest a reading of Mark Twain's famous Harper's Weekly article about the Jews, in which he describes and asks the question that all the various great empires that the Jews lived among have all ceased to exist, but the Jew continues. And he writes these words in 1895, and how much more so after Auschwitz and after the creation of the state of Israel, how much more so the question which he ends, which is what is the secret of the Jews' immortality? Where does that come from? And if I were to summarize the answer, again, this is my act of hubris here to answer Mark Twain's question, it is to suggest that the answer is contained within the Tanakh. And it's a very different understanding of what the Tanakh does. And if I were to summarize what that message is, it's the Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. That what the Nevi'im do is they argue that the Brit is eternal. And so long as we believe ourselves to be in covenant with God, in a destiny which is contains such great meaning, and also which answers so much of what the world is about, being able to give us a sense of where we are, how we fit into the many questions that surround us in any generation, that it's that tool. It's the tools of seeing oneself in a grand national narrative in which we're able to find meaning within our struggles, within our crises that have sustained us and allowed us to continue. To quote from the Haggadah of V'hi Shiam Dalav Oseinu V'lanu. And V'hi is the Brit, and the Brit is protected and carried towards us through the Tanakh in each of the stages, in each of the voices, in each of the crises that the Tanakh presents.
So interesting. I hear what you're saying, and that's a much more, I would call, longitudinal perspective. I think that it kind of reminds me of there's debates in Tanakh itself as to, like, there's different narratives as to why it was the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the first Beis Hamikdash, of course. So Sefer Melachim is pretty clear that it was a function of the sins of Menashe, and it was because of his actions that it got sealed, and the fate could never be reopened, in a sense. But if you read, like, the Nevuos of Yechezkel to those people, it seems a little bit different. He focuses much more on the personal place of every individual, the personal responsibility and portfolio of every individual, and I think that perhaps that changed because Yechezkel was talking to a generation who are already in exile, and the perspective that he was emphasizing was the perspective of ultimately of personal responsibility and, so to speak, looking forward to the future. And I think that perhaps we're more akin, like you're saying, to Yechezkel's perspective, where each person finds himself as part of something. They're not determined by an idea in the past, but perhaps they share something of the past in order to project them towards the future, which they bear responsibility for. So there's certainly is. It happens to be that there's multiple narratives as to responsibility in Tanakh. Some of them are harder to swallow than others.
And I think that's of great importance now as we see the reemergence of a Jewish political identity in Eretz Yisrael and in the modern state of Israel. And there's a temptation in every society to distill one's national identity into the actions of one's political leaders, and to to project onto the person in leadership the entire story of a nation, to tell the man's history and humanity's destiny in the form of great men. And I think that there are certain places in Tanakh where that happens, perhaps the story of Menashe, but to read Sefer Dvarim is to see that message applies not just to the king or to his court, but to every person. And certainly Yechezkel, in responding to destruction, transposes the national identity away from political leaders towards the actions of every person in preserving a distinct Jewish identity, which they will carry forward in the family structures that they protect and that they move through time. And I think they're both true. And obviously, there are different degrees of emphases that we see within different books of Tanakh. And I would argue also that it's not just on the side of the critiques of the Nevi'im, but also who the Nevi'im are speaking to. That there are periods of Tanakh where the Nevi'im are speaking to the kings and to the courts. So there are also other Nevi'im, like Eliyahu and Elisha, who are giving Nevuot to individual people, and the stories of their Nisim on a retail level, which gives us a sense of the changing roles of what the Navi is meant to do. And in total, it's both. It's obviously that the Navi cares about the political decisions of the kings, but it's also the actions of the Hamon Am, of every Jew, to determine that story of who we are as a people.
Yeah, that's extremely well put. That's extremely well put, and I think that, as you pointed out, we're seeing those two ideas converge today a little more, because in the blessed last 72 years, where we've had to think about more nationalistic perspectives, then some of those other themes come back as well, and the responsibility of those themes comes back. Although it's interesting that the perspective of the individual amongst the klal has been one which has sustained us for almost, for well over 1900 years, which is, a majority of Jewish history, essentially, which has been in the exile, in the diaspora experience, which is just so fascinating how Tanakh itself really talks about that. I also find like those kind of things, we have these little hints. Right now I'm learning in a particular Shir Malachim Aleph, and we're learning about Shlomo Melech building the Beis HaMikdash. And as he's putting the cornerstone in the Beis HaMikdash, Hashem talks about, if you don't listen, it's going to get destroyed. And Shlomo Melech, and according to the Midrash, he made a catacomb below it to where to hide the Aron, which indicates that even at the moment of, so to speak, the greatest resurgence in national unity, there's this notion of there's going to be a more complex and history, and that's why Tanakh speaks to us at every moment in time, whether it be the highs, the lows, or the in-betweens.
I think that's a great point, which also gets back to the point about crisis, and that the Tanakh does not present a utopia, it does not present a lost world where everything was wonderful. And even at the high points of our history, to think about King David and Shlomo, and perhaps even Moshe Rabbeinu, like our heroes are never perfect. They are the subject of critique, and it's a fuller picture, but I think it's also a picture which is more resilient to the tests of time, and that if we were to become brittle in our expectations of what Jewish existence means, if we were to say Heichal Hashem, and that's it, then we would not be able to survive a Churban. But it's because Yirmiyahu has already made fun of the people who said Heichal Hashem, that we're able to say, okay, we can survive without. And I think it's a muscle that we can never lose. That as we're experiencing Geula, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, to use the term from our prayer for Medinat Yisrael, that we have to be very cautious that we not come to believe that somehow that grit, that resilience on a moral level, on a spiritual level, of being able to live with problematic leaders, the ability to live through difficult times, that these skills are also part of the secret sauce, that it's not simply Lashon Haba Yerushalayim, but it's Lashon Haba Yerushalayim with leaders and with problems and with all sorts of complexity that the Tanakh preserves.
Precisely. Precisely. And that's exactly why it is such a it is our guide document. It is something which we continue to learn and endeavor and delve into. It's incredible. And maybe we can just pivot over here, because I know that we're both doing programs for Shavuot where we're expanding our reach for the community as a Nachathon. Tell me a little bit about how it's working in your side. How do you divide it up in your community?
Excellent. So we're doing a Siyum Tanakh for Shavuot this year. Now, obviously, we're not going to be gathering in person, but we've assigned 5 chapter sections to members of our congregation, and God willing, we'll hit 929 in terms of full commitments. I think we're about 3/4 or 4/5 of the way there in terms of assigning Tanakh to everyone, and each person is going to study b'chavruso or alone and study the material, utilizing the perushim that they have, and also many of the resources that are available through 929 in order to learn. And then together on Shavuot, we're going to, or before Shavuot, we're going to have a communal celebration of our learning. And it's something very beautiful to be able to engage in the study of Tanakh as a community as a whole, and also to be able to turn to our people and say to them, learn something you never learned before, jump in. And while there's only 5 chapters that you might be studying, those 5 chapters are inevitably connected to other chapters. And that's almost like being in a library and opening up one book, and you can look at the book next to it and the book on the other side of it. And it becomes an opportunity to taste and to be brought into the beauty of what Tanakh affords us. Tell me about your project.
It's so exciting. It's actually very similar, and we didn't even collaborate beforehand. It's just it's incredible to see. I also had the same idea, and so we're also doing five prakim, 5 chapters per person, and we're actually doing the 742. So we're doing Nevi'im and Ksuvim, although the Torah absolutely should be included. But we're doing 742. I think we're almost there. Wherever I said, like you said, we're around maybe 80-85%. Just a few more little arm twistings here and there for the good of the people themselves. But it's to me, what makes me so proud is when I see somebody who's not been involved in anything particularly, not the typical people who are involved in learning projects, who decide, let me give this a try. And it's so validating because, if you just open up a book of Nach, there's so much there. The depth, the richness, the identity, the wisdom, everything comes out if you just give yourselves the space to do it. And 5 chapters is not a crazy amount. And so this way, so one of the things which is great is I do 10-minute podcasts of Nach. So I say to people, look, I'm sure you can spend, here's the app. I'm sure you could spend, 50 minutes, 50 minutes over the course of the next few weeks, and you'll be able to do that. But inevitably, what happens is that clearly 10 minutes is not enough to cover a chapter in Tanakh. So then at that point in time, it now opens up that conversation, that dialogue. And as you said, once you sit down in the library, you never really leave it, and it's extremely validating. What we're going to do, I've been debating in my head like what to do, and I thought that the nice way to do it is we're going to actually do our siyum at the Havdalah on Motzei Shavuot. And the reason is that I want to also give those people who feel a little bit behind the 8 ball, I want to give them the opportunity of using the Shavuos to finish it up. And then at the Havdalah, we'll have a musical Havdalah. That'll be the time. What I would like to also do, God willing, is I'd like to have people share their perspectives. I like to share people share how they grew through this, how they learned from this, and perhaps share short sound bites, because it's all very nice from a top down. We talked about leader versus people. I like to hear the people, because the insights of the every person in the community matters and is valuable so much.
I would agree with you in terms of the beauty of those interactions. That when a person opens up Tanakh and then they have all these questions that they're able to interact with their friends and with me also, to be able to say, Rabbi, you asked me to learn some Tanakh. Well, Rabbi, I have a list of questions for you now that you've had me do this.
Brilliant.
And it becomes the spark for a different type of chavrusa in terms of bringing these words to life. And that's something really of great value. So let's see, a couple more minutes now. I hope maybe we can spend a little bit of time talking about a specific crisis in Tanakh that you found specifically meaningful or valuable, both objectively, but also in light of what we're going through now as a world and facing COVID-19.
Sure, that's a very tough question. That's a very tough question. I guess it depends where a person is right now, and every part of Tanakh has different ways of reflecting. So I happen to be learning Melachim, and I happen to be learning Eov right now personally. And as I move through Eov, I find it particularly meaningful in this, and it's the crisis of an individual. That, as the Gemara debates as to who Eov was, one of the things that the Gemara suggests at the end is that ultimately Eov was not a particular individual. There are many suggestions as to when historically he could have lived, but one of the commentaries in the Gemara is that he never really existed. And I think what the Gemara essentially is saying is that Eov is not relegated or left to be any individual. He is a specific individual. He can be any individual. We meet many Eovs in life, and I think that one of the things that strikes me about Eov, which to me is just so meaningful, especially now, is that there's a lot of suffering right now. There's a lot of suffering on the side of health. First, when this crisis started opening up over here, unfortunately, in the neck of the woods that we live in, unfortunately, we've been very, very hard hit. At a certain point, we're having a funeral in the community every day. So it was very, very intense. The funeral rate has dropped somewhat significantly, thank God, but the suffering continues. There's people who are in Avelos, there are people who are sick, there are people who have loved ones who are sick, the financial crisis continues to unfold. There's a lot of difficulty, and one of the things that I learned, and I'm continuing to learn from Eov, is that his questions, this unknown individual, his questions come from a deeply profound connection with Hashem. And that every question that he's asking is not a question because he's rejecting, but rather a question because he loves Hashem so much. He can't understand the actions of Hashem. And I think that in finding meaning, one of the starting point that we'll call the bedrock of the conversation is the notion that Hashem loves us and that Hashem cares about us. Now, once we get to that, now that we've established that, now the question is so how can this happen? How can things happen? How do we understand this? But without that bedrock, then the conversation is quite different. That was one of the ideas, and it's very much less than the national and the international and the China and the rest of the world, and could they warn us and not warn us, and how could God let this happen in the world? It's much more on the personal level. Is that personal conversation that we are allowed to have? We have it with the same deference and the same perspective that Eov does have in his experience. That to me was meaningful. How about you? What are your any striking moments as well?
So following perhaps in your footsteps, I think that Tehillim as a book also taps into a certain emunah and a certain love that the author, that David HaMelech, feels towards Hashem in composing each of the parakim of Tehillim. And there's something of the Jewish personality which is contained within each parak of Tehillim, of being able to say, Gam ki elech b'geit salmaves lo irara ki ata imadi. That is the I guess the motto of the Jew, Ki ata imadi, of being able to look at God and say that God, you're with me, and because of that, I'm going to be able to endure any conflict, any tragedy that comes. I know what to do because I have the words of Tehillim with me, and they're going to sustain me no matter what it is that I face. And but even as we read those words of Tehillim, there sometimes can be points in which the words don't sit right with us as in our moments of fear, our moments of suffering, our moments of grief. And as rabbis who help people through their happiest times and through their saddest times, that's something that we're keenly aware of. That there's something very useful in being able to give a person tehillim and say, let these words accompany you. Just say the words and feel the words. But even as those words are said and felt, there's often a gap between what a person thinks in terms of that love of God, that presence of Hashem, and there's a struggle that we inevitably face in knowing that those questions have been asked before, be it through Eov or through David HaMelech or elsewhere, that to know that the questions have been asked, but each of us needs to find our own answer in our own struggles, and that's a very important tool and a useful tool, and I think that's something that we can appreciate every time we open up Tehillim. But I think that there's also a gold mine of individual crises that can be read through Tanakh and to be appreciated through Tanakh in all sorts of different ways. So, whether it be Yirmiyahu cursed in the day in which he was born, in which he turns around and says to God, "Why did you do this to me? I know this isn't working." And that struggle of an individual Navi. Or to think about Chizkiyahu's moment in which he's surrounded by the armies of the Assyrians, and he has to somehow get through that moment, to somehow be able to respond to his own doubts about whether it was the right thing to do to bring the people into rebellion against the Assyrians and their gods. And those moments of crises are recorded within the Tanakh, and we get to hear the voices of men and sometimes women as they inhabit those roles of that are, I believe, depicted in Tehillim from the inside. We also get to read them from the outside as well. And there's, as we said earlier, there's just so much crises here. In some respects, Tanakh is a record of crises because the non-crises parts, though they aren't interesting. So the Tanakh doesn't spend much time talking about that. It's specifically when the Jews worship Avodah Zarah, the Nevi'im are upset with them that the Nevi'im have to write. When everyone's going to Daf Yomi and studying 929, there's not the same need to talk about the crises, but it's something which is very, very relevant at all times, and I think even more so now as we experience a crisis across the world and in each of our own hearts.
Very well said. Very well said. I also find that to your point is that like one of the most understudied books of Tehillim is Book 3, and Book 3 is rarely quoted in our davening because it's so heavy, and it's the much darker side of Tehillim, and that's why we perhaps are less familiar with it. But that's particularly one of the places to start, as you were saying, where David Melech really struggles with and grapples with real issues, and gives words perhaps to crisis, which are in a very different way than perhaps we're used to seeing Tehillim.
Excellent. So if we're going to try to leave our listeners or our viewers with an approach to this moment of crisis in light of Tanakh. I think that we've touched a couple of bases in terms of seeing ourselves as part of a grand national narrative that the Tanakh allows us to be a part of, even though obviously the Tanakh is not still being written, but the messages of the Tanakh are still being read and still being felt. And we see ourselves along the trajectory that the Tanakh lays out. And I think that also there are many parts of the Tanakh that speak about the crises that have come before us, and that knowing that we as human beings have experienced horrible crises in the past can give us a little sense of confidence that we can get through the crises of the present as well. Are there bases that we're missing that we've not covered? If we're going to tell our people when they get off this video, or this whatever you're going to call it, this conversation, when you wake up tomorrow morning and you have to face another day of isolation, what else can Tanakh teach us about that challenge?
So I think you really covered most of the ideas we talked about, and there's obviously much more. But the one thing I would disagree with is I said that, I think Tanakh is still being written, and I think that, God willing, when Mashiach comes, I think there's going to be a moment where everything we're doing is going to be written down. Well, the things that mattered, the things that mattered for us as a nation, the things that mattered for us as individuals making up that nation. I think waking up with that affirmation of knowing, like you said, that connection to the past, the emunah in Hashem, but not just that, but that, God willing, when that last book in the canon of Tanakh is going to be talked about, Yomos HaMashiach, I hope that we make a dent. I hope that we've woken up in the morning and done something to make a change in that on a micro and macro level. That's my hope.
So Rav Aaron has a famous essay, Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, about Torah's Emes and Torah's Chesed, in which he talks about not just Tanakh and Torah Sheba'al Peh, but within Torah Sheba'al Peh itself, that there are moments where we have something which is codified and is strict and direct, and there's also moments of Chesed, which are Torah, which is not quite subjective, but has the individual imprint that we each bring to that Torah. And in terms of the Torah of Tanakh, if I can be so bold as to add a small footnote to what you described about the ongoing writing, if we conceive of Tanakh or the Torah with a capital T, that it's a Torah which is a Torah's Chesed, in addition to being a Torah's Emes, then I would be with you 100% in saying that it's still being written even now, and that the Svarim that are behind me and behind you are always being added to, and that we always had that opportunity to be a Beis Medrash with Chidush, because there's no Beis Medrash without. And God willing, this conversation will be just one more piece of that Beis Medrash with Chidush, and that's this crisis will be another crisis among those many crises in which we formulate and we live a Torah's Emes and a Torah's Chesed and a Torah's Chaim, a living Torah as well. And so I give you and all our listeners the bracha that we should have strength in the face of everything that we face, and that you should be able to be mechazek your people as we face terrible grief and terrible sadness and terrible tragedy and so many questions, but that you should have the koach to be able to give them the medicine of Emunah that has served us well throughout the Tanakh and beyond. So
Amen.
for you.
Amen. What a beautiful thing. I really enjoyed this. Amen. V'chen nomar. And God willing, everybody who's listening, take the opportunity of continuing the conversation. This is just the diving board into the creativity and the perspective of each and every one of you as you invest yourselves in the greatest part of our history and identity, which is our Tanakh. Thank you so much for that, Strauchler.
Thank you, Rav Yaakov, Kol HaKavod, and good luck with the Siyum.
Thank you. I look forward to comparing notes soon.
Excellent. Very, very good. Shakawa.
Kol Tov.